Picture this. It's 1862, and Confederate scouts are positioned in the hills overlooking Cincinnati, Ohio. Through their telescopes, they watch Union facilities day and night, documenting troop movements, supply shipments, and fortification construction. But there's something they're hearing that doesn't concern them. The constant pounding of hammers and the whir of machinery coming from a nondescript workshop on the edge of town. They write it off, probably just another batch of rifles being assembled, maybe wagon wheels, standard war production, nothing worth reporting in detail. Those scouts had no idea they were listening to the future of warfare being born. Inside that workshop, a brilliant, and some would say obsessive, inventor named Richard Jordan Gatling was perfecting a weapon that would change combat forever. The Gatling gun, the world's first practical rapid-fire weapon. But here's the fascinating part. Even though the Gatling gun was invented during the Civil War, it barely saw any action in it. The weapon that could have changed the course of battles was held back by bureaucracy, skepticism, and terrible timing. By the time military leaders realized what they had, the war was nearly over. If you want to discover how a revolutionary weapon sat on the sidelines during America's bloodiest conflict, and how Confederate intelligence completely missed one of the most important military developments happening right under their noses, hit that subscribe button, and let's dive into this incredible story. Chapter 1. The inventor who wanted to end war by making it worse. Richard Jordan Gatling was not your typical weapons manufacturer. Born in North Carolina in 1818, he grew up in a farming family and showed an early aptitude for mechanical innovation. By his 20s, he had already patented several agricultural devices, including a successful rice sewing machine that made him a comfortable fortune. Gatling was an inventor first, businessman second, and he had no particular interest in military affairs. But when the Civil War broke out in 1861, Gatling found himself haunted by a paradoxical idea. What if he could invent a weapon so devastating that it would actually reduce casualties? His reasoning went like this. If one soldier with one weapon could do the work of 100 men, then armies could be smaller. Smaller armies would mean fewer deaths. It was the logic of deterrence before the concept had a name, and it was tragically naive. Gatling contracted typhoid fever in 1861 while working in a crowded military hospital. This experience convinced him that disease killed more soldiers than bullets did, which was absolutely true. Roughly 2 soldiers died of disease for every one killed in combat during the Civil War. But his solution was peculiar. Create a weapon so effective that battles would be shorter and soldiers would spend less time in disease-ridden camps. The faster you could win, the fewer men would die of dysentery, pneumonia, and infected wounds. With this twisted humanitarian logic driving him, Gatling began designing his rapid-fire gun in late 1861. He wasn't the first to attempt such a weapon. The concept of mechanized rapid fire had been around for decades, with various volley guns and organ guns seeing limited use. But these designs were unreliable, prone to jamming, and often as dangerous to their operators as to the enemy. Gatling's breakthrough was elegance through rotation. Instead of trying to make one barrel fire faster, he would use multiple barrels arranged in a circle, each one loading, firing, and ejecting in sequence as the barrels rotated. It was inspired by his agricultural machinery, the same principle that made his seed planter work efficiently. One barrel fires while the next one loads, while another ejects its spent cartridge. Continuous rotation, continuous fire. By early 1862, he had built his first prototype in Cincinnati, a city firmly under Union control and bustling with war production. The workshop where he assembled it was unremarkable from the outside, just another industrial space among dozens supporting the war effort. The hammering, drilling, and mechanical testing that went on inside sounded like any other manufacturing operation. This is where Confederate intelligence failed catastrophically. Southern scouts and spies operated extensively throughout border states like Ohio and Cincinnati. Sitting right on the Ohio River across from Kentucky, was a priority target for surveillance. They knew about troop concentrations, they knew about supply depots, they tracked railroad shipments, but they didn't understand what was happening in Gatling's workshop because they had no framework for understanding it. The concept of a mechanized rapid-fire weapon was so foreign to military thinking that even hearing reports of such a thing wouldn't have made sense. The scouts heard the hammers. They just didn't hear the future. Chapter 2. The weapon that terrified its own observers. On a cold morning in late 1862, Richard Gatling invited a small group of military observers and potential investors to witness a demonstration of his invention. The location was a field outside Indianapolis, far enough from prying eyes but accessible enough for Union officers to attend. What they saw that day should have changed the war immediately, but it didn't. Gatling's refined prototype sat on a wheeled carriage, looking like a strange hybrid between an artillery piece and an organ pipe. 6 barrels clustered together in a circular arrangement with a hand crank on the side and a hopper feed system on top. It looked almost comical, like something from a Jules Verne story. Several officers exchanged skeptical glances. They'd seen plenty of wonder weapons demonstrated, and most were disasters. Then Gatling's assistant began turning the crank. The sound was unlike anything in warfare at that time. Not the singular crack of a rifle, not even the thunderous boom of a cannon, but a mechanical, ripping roar that seemed to tear the air itself. The Gatling gun fired continuously, each barrel discharging in rapid succession as it rotated past the firing position. Paper targets downrange disintegrated. Wooden posts splintered into fragments. The weapon maintained a rate of fire around 200 rounds per minute, a number that seemed physically impossible to officers accustomed to soldiers firing perhaps 3 aimed shots per minute with a rifle. The demonstration lasted less than 5 minutes, but in that time, the Gatling gun fired more rounds than an entire company of infantry could have fired in the same period. The sound alone was psychologically devastating. Several observers later admitted they found it genuinely frightening, even knowing they were in no danger. But here's where military conservatism and bureaucratic inertia became Gatling's enemy. The officers were impressed, even awed, but they were also deeply skeptical. How reliable was it? Would it jam under battlefield conditions? How much did it weigh? Could it be transported easily? What about ammunition supply? This thing would chew through cartridges faster than supply wagons could deliver them. And perhaps most importantly, who would operate it? Was it artillery? Infantry support? Something entirely new? There was also a darker concern whispered among some officers. Richard Gatling was born in North Carolina, a Confederate state. His sympathies were unclear. Could this be an elaborate scheme to sell faulty weapons to the Union? Even though Gatling had no Confederate connections and lived in Union territory, the suspicion lingered. In the paranoid atmosphere of the Civil War, where spies and saboteurs were a constant concern, trust was a precious commodity. The United States Army Ordnance Department, responsible for evaluating and purchasing weapons, moved with glacial bureaucratic slowness. They wanted more tests, more data, more assurances. Meanwhile, the war raged on with conventional weapons, and men died in vast numbers at places like Antietam and Fredericksburg. battles where concentrated firepower might have made a decisive difference. Gatling returned to his workshop. Frustrated but determined, he refined his design, switching from paper cartridges to more reliable metallic cartridges, improving the feed mechanism, and making the entire system more robust. By 1863, he had a production model ready. He even secured a patent and arranged for a manufacturing contract with a factory in Cincinnati. But the orders didn't come. The Gatling gun sat in warehouses, a revolutionary weapon waiting for someone in authority to recognize its potential. Confederate scouts continued their surveillance of Union facilities, noting troop movements and supply stockpiles, still unaware that the most significant military development of the war was sitting unused in storage. It's worth noting the historical irony. The Confederacy was desperate for any military advantage, and their intelligence network completely missed the one weapon that could have changed everything. If Confederate leadership had understood what Gatling was building, they might have attempted to sabotage the project, steal the designs, or at minimum prepared countermeasures. Instead, they remained ignorant, and the Union squandered its advantage through institutional inertia. Chapter 3. Why the Union Army said no to a superweapon. To understand why the Union Army rejected the Gatling gun during most of the Civil War, we need to understand the military mindset of the 1860s. This was an era when warfare was still considered something of a gentleman's pursuit, governed by rules and conventions that seem almost quaint by modern standards. The idea of mechanized killing was not just novel. It was disturbing to many professional officers. General James Ripley, the Chief of Army Ordnance from 1861 to 1863, was the primary obstacle to Gatling gun adoption. Ripley was 67 years old when the war began, a career officer who had fought in the War of 1812 as a young man. He was competent, honest, and utterly conservative in his thinking. To Ripley, the standard muzzle-loading rifle musket was perfectly adequate. He had seen the Army through the Mexican-American War with such weapons, and he saw no reason to change now. Ripley's opposition to innovation was legendary. He resisted breech-loading rifles, he opposed metallic cartridges, and he fought against any weapon system that deviated from established patterns. His reasoning was actually logical from a certain perspective. The Union Army was expanding from 16,000 men to over 1 million. Training this enormous force was a monumental challenge. Introducing new, complex weapons would complicate logistics, training, and supply. Better to stick with proven systems that everyone understood. The Gatling gun represented everything Ripley opposed. It was mechanically complex, required specialized training, consumed ammunition at an alarming rate, and had no established tactical doctrine for its use. Where would it fit in the battle line? How would officers command units equipped with it? What happened when it broke down in the field? These weren't trivial questions, and Gatling didn't have good answers for all of them. There was also the ammunition question, which was genuinely serious. A single Gatling gun could fire more rounds in 1 hour than an entire infantry company could fire in a day. The Union Army's supply system was already stretched thin, getting standard ammunition to troops. How would they supply Gatling guns without starving regular infantry of ammunition? The logistical challenges were daunting. Beyond practical concerns, there was a deeper philosophical resistance. Many officers viewed the Gatling gun as ungentlemanly, even cowardly. War was supposed to involve courage, discipline, and martial skill. A mechanical device that allowed one man to kill dozens seemed to remove the human element from combat. There was genuine moral discomfort with the idea, even among officers who should have recognized its tactical value. Confederate intelligence, ironically, shared this dismissive attitude. Reports did occasionally filter back to Richmond about a rapid-fire gun being demonstrated in the North, but these were given low priority. Southern military leaders assumed it was either impractical, unreliable, or propaganda. They had their own weapons development to worry about. The Confederacy was experimenting with submarines, primitive landmines, and various other innovations born of desperation. By 1863, General Ripley had been replaced, and the new ordnance leadership was somewhat more open to innovation. But by this time, the Army had invested heavily in conventional weapons production. Factories were churning out Springfield rifles by the thousands. The supply chain was established. The training regimen was standardized. Introducing a fundamentally different weapon system now would cause more disruption than benefit. There was also a timing problem. The Gatling gun was most effective in defensive positions or when suppressing enemy positions at medium range. But by 1863, 1864, the nature of the war was changing. The Union Army was increasingly focused on mobile campaigns, Sherman's March to the Sea, Grant's Overland Campaign, where speed and maneuverability mattered more than concentrated firepower. The Gatling gun, with its ammunition requirements and relatively heavy weight, seemed less relevant to this style of warfare. A few individual officers did purchase Gatling guns with their own money or with funds raised from their units. General Benjamin Butler bought a dozen for his Army of the James. They saw limited use in the Petersburg Campaign, where they were employed in defensive fortifications. Reports from these engagements were positive. The weapons performed reliably and had a significant psychological impact on Confederate attackers. But these successes came too late to influence broader Army policy. Chapter 4. The Petersburg Siege and the Gatling's Brief Moment. The Siege of Petersburg, lasting from June 1864 to March 1865, represented trench warfare at its most brutal. Union forces surrounded the vital railroad hub of Petersburg, Virginia, while Confederate defenders under General Robert E. Lee held an extensive network of fortifications. Both sides dug in for a grinding, attritional struggle that prefigured the Western Front of World War I by 50 years. And it was here, finally, that the Gatling gun saw its first real combat use. General Benjamin Butler, commanding the Army of the James, was an unusual figure. A successful civilian lawyer and politician before the war, he had no formal military training but possessed an open mind about innovation. When Butler learned about the Gatling gun through military channels, he didn't dismiss it as his more conservative colleagues had. Instead, he used political connections and his own personal funds to purchase 12 Gatling guns for his command. The weapons arrived in August 1864, and Butler immediately assigned them to key defensive positions along his lines. The tactical situation at Petersburg was ideal for the Gatling gun's capabilities. Both sides faced each other across relatively short distances, often just 200 or 300 yards of open ground. Confederate forces periodically launched attacks trying to break through Union positions, and these assaults required concentrated defensive fire to repel. The first significant use of Gatling guns came during a Confederate probe on August 18, 1864. Southern forces, attempting to test Union defenses, advanced toward a fortified position defended by, among other weapons, 2 of Butler's Gatling guns. The Confederate soldiers had no idea what they were about to face. As the gray-clad troops emerged from their trenches and advanced across no man's land, the Gatling guns opened fire. The effect was devastating, both physically and psychologically. The distinctive ripping sound of the weapons immediately drew attention from both sides. Confederate soldiers, expecting rifle fire and perhaps some artillery, instead found themselves facing continuous, concentrated fire that seemed impossible. The attack faltered within minutes. Confederate commanders, observing from their positions, couldn't understand what was happening. The volume of fire coming from that section of the Union line seemed incomprehensible. Some initially thought they were facing a much larger force than intelligence had indicated. Others assumed some new form of artillery was being employed. In the after-action reports, Confederate officers described the Union position as defended by some form of rapid-fire weapon and continuous discharge of firearms. But these reports were vague, lacking technical detail, and by this late stage of the war, Confederate leadership had more pressing concerns than investigating Union weapons development. The South was running out of men, supplies, and time. A new Union weapon was just one more problem in a long list of catastrophic problems. The psychological impact of the Gatling guns extended beyond their actual tactical effect. Confederate soldiers began to dread attacking positions rumored to have the coffee mill guns, or Union organ guns, as they called them. The sound alone was unnerving. That mechanical, relentless rattling that promised death with industrial efficiency. Butler's Gatling guns performed reliably throughout the Petersburg siege, but they were used cautiously. Ammunition supply was always a concern, and commanders learned to employ them in short bursts during critical moments rather than sustained fire. The guns also required maintenance, cleaning, oiling, and occasional part replacement, but this proved manageable with proper training. One particularly interesting incident occurred in October 1864, when Confederate sharpshooters targeted a Gatling gun position, trying to kill the crews operating the weapons. This was actually a tactical error on the Confederacy's part. By concentrating fire on the Gatling position, they revealed their sniper locations, which were then suppressed by the very weapon they were trying to destroy. The Gatling gun's rate of fire made it excellent for counter-sniper work, saturating suspected sniper positions with enough fire that return shooting became impossible. Despite these successes, the Gatling gun remained peripheral to the overall campaign. Petersburg fell not because of superior Union weaponry, but because of overwhelming numerical and logistical superiority. The Confederacy simply ran out of the ability to resist. When Lee finally abandoned Petersburg in April 1865, leading to the retreat that ended at Appomattox, Gatling guns played no role in the pursuit. The weapons had proven themselves effective, but they'd done so too late and in too limited a capacity to change anyone's mind about their value. The war ended with the Gatling gun still considered an interesting experiment rather than a necessary tool. Chapter 5. What Confederate intelligence actually knew and didn't know. The Confederate intelligence apparatus during the Civil War was surprisingly sophisticated for its time. The South operated extensive spy networks throughout the North, employed civilian scouts along the border states, and maintained communication lines that could get information from Washington to Richmond in a matter of days. Confederate intelligence knew about Union troop movements, political debates, and industrial production. They had detailed knowledge of Northern morale, economic conditions, and military planning. But they completely missed the significance of the Gatling gun, and understanding why reveals crucial lessons about intelligence failures. First, Confederate scouts did actually report on unusual weapons development. Archives in Richmond contain several reports mentioning rapid-fire mechanisms and mechanical guns being produced in northern factories. But these reports were filed alongside dozens of other claims about Union's secret weapons, everything from armored war balloons to explosive bullets to poisoned bayonets. The Confederacy was flooded with information, much of it exaggerated or false, and they lacked the analytical framework to separate genuine threats from fantasy. Second, the scouts observing Cincinnati and other manufacturing centers were looking for quantity, not innovation. They counted rifle shipments, noted artillery pieces, tracked uniform production. They were intelligence collectors, not technical analysts. When they heard machinery running in Gatling's workshop, they assumed it was producing standard military equipment. They had no reason to investigate further because they didn't know what questions to ask. Third, the very concept of a rapid-fire mechanical weapon was so alien to contemporary military thinking that even accurate reports were dismissed. Confederate Secretary of War James Seddon received at least 3 detailed reports about a rotating barrel gun between 1862 and 1864, but he marked them as low priority and unverified. Seddon was dealing with immediate crises, food shortages, desertion, collapsing supply lines, and reports about experimental weapons seemed irrelevant to his immediate problems. There's a fascinating case study in Confederate intelligence failure from July 1863. A Confederate sympathizer working in a Cincinnati factory sent detailed information about Gatling gun production to Richmond. The report was remarkably accurate, including barrel specifications, rate of fire estimates, and even rough technical drawings. This intelligence package made it to the desk of Josiah Gorgas, the Confederacy's chief of ordnance, the man who would have understood its implications better than anyone else in the Confederate government. Gorgas read the report, made notes in the margin, and filed it away. His notes survive in the archives. If accurate, potentially significant, but no battlefield confirmation. Recommend observation of reported weapon in use before committing resources to countermeasures. Gorgas was being rational. He couldn't afford to chase every rumor of Union superweapons when he was already struggling to produce enough basic rifles and ammunition for Confederate forces. But here's the tragic irony. By the time Gatling guns saw battlefield use at Petersburg in August 1864, the Confederacy was in no position to develop countermeasures anyway. The South's industrial capacity was collapsing, blockade runners were being captured at increasing rates, and the economy was in freefall. Even if Gorgas had recognized the Gatling gun's significance in 1863, the Confederacy likely couldn't have done anything substantive about it. Confederate scouts also faced a fundamental challenge: access. Cincinnati was deep in Union territory, surrounded by thousands of Federal troops. Southern agents operating there had to maintain cover identities and couldn't risk extensive technical reconnaissance. The workshops where Gatling refined his designs were guarded, not because the Army considered them high-priority targets, but simply because all war production facilities had basic security. Confederate agents couldn't just walk in and examine the equipment. Interestingly, the Confederacy did attempt to develop its own rapid-fire weapons. Several inventors in the South proposed various designs, including a double-barreled revolving rifle and a multi-barrel volley gun. But these projects were hamstrung by lack of resources, manufacturing capacity, and time. The South couldn't even produce enough standard rifles. Experimenting with exotic new weapons was a luxury they couldn't afford. By 1865, Confederate intelligence reports about Gatling guns became more frequent and more accurate, but by then it was too late to matter. The reports confirmed what some officers suspected. The Union had deployed a weapon that could dramatically increase defensive firepower. But the Confederacy was weeks away from collapse, and this information was simply filed away with all the other indicators of Union military superiority. Chapter 6. How the Gatling gun changed warfare after the war. The Civil War ended in April 1865, with the Gatling gun having played only a minor role in the conflict. But the decades that followed saw Gatling's invention transform from a curiosity into a weapon that fundamentally changed how wars were fought. The story of this transformation reveals how military innovation often takes years, even decades, to achieve its full impact. Immediately after the war, the U.S. Army remained skeptical about the Gatling gun. The weapon had performed adequately at Petersburg and in a few other engagements, but most officers still considered it a specialized tool rather than an essential weapon. The Army purchased 100 Gatling guns in 1866, more out of curiosity than conviction, and assigned them to various frontier posts and coastal fortifications. It was on the American frontier that the Gatling gun first demonstrated its true potential. During the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 1880s, Gatling guns proved devastatingly effective in defensive situations. At Fort Richardson in Texas, a single Gatling gun defended against a Comanche raid, firing over 500 rounds in less than 3 minutes and breaking the attack completely. Similar incidents occurred throughout the West, and gradually, field commanders began requesting the weapons. But the Gatling gun's real impact came through international adoption. European armies, observing American developments with interest, began their own evaluations. The British Army was particularly enthusiastic, purchasing Gatling guns in 1869 and deploying them in colonial conflicts across Africa and Asia. The weapon proved ideal for colonial warfare. A small number of European soldiers equipped with Gatling guns could dominate much larger indigenous forces armed with traditional weapons. This colonial use of Gatling guns foreshadowed the terrible efficiency of mechanized warfare. At the Battle of Ulundi in 1879, British forces in South Africa used Gatling guns to devastating effect against Zulu warriors. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the British formed a defensive square and used Gatling guns to mow down waves of Zulu attackers. The battle was a massacre, and it demonstrated that technological superiority could overcome nearly any numerical disadvantage. The psychological impact of the Gatling gun in these colonial contexts was profound. The weapon's sound alone, that distinctive mechanical roar, became associated with European military dominance. Indigenous forces learned to fear positions defended by Gatling guns, and this fear was often as effective as the weapons themselves in breaking attacks before they fully developed. Richard Gatling continued to improve his design throughout the 1870s and 1880s. He increased the rate of fire, improved reliability, and experimented with different calibers and configurations. By 1880, Gatling guns could fire up to 600 rounds per minute, 3 times the rate of the original 1862 model. The weapon became lighter, more portable, and easier to maintain. Gatling's company became internationally successful, selling weapons to armies across the world. However, Gatling never shook his peculiar belief that he was reducing the suffering of war. In interviews and writings, he continued to argue that his weapon would make wars shorter and therefore less bloody. He couldn't see, or refused to see, that his invention was actually enabling more efficient killing. The logic of deterrence through superior firepower proved tragically wrong. Wars didn't become shorter or less frequent. They became more deadly. The true test of the Gatling gun's impact came in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. American forces used Gatling guns extensively in Cuba, and the weapons proved their worth at battles like San Juan Hill. Theodore Roosevelt, commanding the Rough Riders, later wrote about the devastating effectiveness of Gatling guns in suppressing Spanish positions. the weapons had finally achieved full integration into U.S. military doctrine, 36 years after Gatling's first prototype. But by the turn of the century, the Gatling gun was already becoming obsolete. New designs using recoil or gas operation, fully automatic weapons that didn't require hand cranking, were emerging. Hiram Maxim's machine gun, invented in 1884, used the weapon's own recoil to cycle the mechanism, achieving higher rates of fire with less mechanical complexity. By 1900, military planners recognized that the future belonged to fully automatic weapons, not hand-cranked designs. Richard Gatling died in 1903, just as his invention was being superseded by newer technology. He had lived long enough to see his creation achieve worldwide adoption, but not long enough to see the full horror of mechanized warfare that his gun prefigured. World War I, beginning just 11 years after his death, would see machine guns, the direct descendants of Gatling's invention, kill millions and create the nightmare landscape of trench warfare. The bitter irony is complete. Gatling invented his weapon to reduce the suffering of war, and instead, he helped create the conditions for industrial-scale slaughter. The Confederate scouts who ignored the sound of hammers in 1862 couldn't have imagined that those hammers were forging a tool that would help transform warfare from a human-scale endeavor into mechanized carnage. Chapter 7. The Intelligence Lesson that every military ignores. The story of Confederate scouts missing the Gatling gun development isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a case study in how militaries consistently fail to recognize game-changing innovations, even when evidence sits right in front of them. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and understanding why it happens reveals fundamental truths about military institutions and human psychology. Intelligence failures like this share common characteristics. First, there's the problem of information overload. Confederate intelligence services received hundreds of reports weekly about Union activities. Most were routine: troop movements, supply shipments, morale assessments. Hidden among this flood of data were occasional mentions of unusual weapons development, but these signals were drowned out by noise. Modern intelligence agencies face the same challenge, just at vastly greater scale. Second, there's the tyranny of the present. Confederate leadership was dealing with immediate existential crises. Should they concentrate forces in Virginia or Tennessee? How could they break the Union blockade? What could be done about food shortages and desertion? In this context, reports about experimental weapons seemed like a distraction. Intelligence analysts prioritized information that addressed immediate needs, not potential future threats. This is entirely rational behavior, but it means that transformative developments are consistently undervalued until they become immediate problems. Third, there's institutional conservatism. Military organizations are inherently conservative because they must be. Training, doctrine, and equipment procurement all require stability and standardization. An army can't function if it's constantly adopting new systems. But this necessary conservatism creates blind spots. When something truly novel emerges, something that doesn't fit existing categories, military institutions struggle to process it. The Gatling gun wasn't artillery, wasn't infantry small arms, wasn't cavalry equipment. It was something new, and there was no organizational structure ready to evaluate it properly. The lesson has repeated throughout military history. Before World War I, military observers from multiple nations watched the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905 and saw machine guns slaughter advancing infantry in waves. But European armies largely dismissed these lessons, assuming that superior European morale and training would overcome mere firepower. 10 years later, the Western Front proved them catastrophically wrong. Before World War II, observers watched the Spanish Civil War and saw German and Italian aircraft devastate ground forces through close air support and strategic bombing. But many military establishments, particularly France, dismissed these lessons as specific to Spanish conditions. The fall of France in 1940 demonstrated the error of this thinking. During the Cold War, American intelligence agencies received numerous reports about Soviet developments in guided missiles, nuclear weapons, and space technology. Many were dismissed as propaganda or exaggeration until Soviet achievements, particularly Sputnik in 1957, proved that the reports were accurate. The missile gap panic that followed was partly caused by intelligence agencies discounting information that challenged comfortable assumptions. Even in recent conflicts, this pattern continues. Before the Gulf War in 1991, American military planners underestimated the impact of GPS-guided weapons and stealth technology. Before the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, intelligence agencies underestimated the effectiveness of improvised explosive devices and asymmetric warfare tactics. In Ukraine today, both Russian and Western analysts have been repeatedly surprised by the effectiveness of drone warfare and social media-coordinated military operations. The Confederate scouts who heard hammers in Cincinnati were doing their job exactly as trained. They collected information about visible, tangible threats, troops, fortifications, supplies. They lacked the technical expertise to understand that those hammers were forging something revolutionary, and their leadership lacked the analytical framework to piece together fragmentary reports into a coherent understanding of the threat. This was a systemic failure, not an individual one. What makes these intelligence failures particularly frustrating is that the information is usually available. The Confederate government had reports about Gatling gun development. They simply didn't believe them, didn't understand their significance, or didn't have resources to investigate further. The intelligence didn't fail. The analysis and decision-making failed. Richard Gatling's invention succeeded despite institutional resistance because the weapon eventually proved itself undeniable. But consider how many potentially revolutionary developments are abandoned because they never get that chance. How many innovations die in workshops and laboratories because military institutions can't recognize their potential until it's too late. The sound of hammers in 1862 wasn't just building the Gatling gun. It was demonstrating a fundamental truth about military innovation. The most important developments are often invisible until they're used against you. Confederate scouts heard those hammers, documented them, and moved on to more immediately relevant intelligence targets. By the time they understood what they'd missed, the war was over, and the nature of warfare had changed forever. Every military institution studies this history. Every intelligence agency trains analysts to watch for game-changing developments. And yet the pattern repeats, because the institutional pressures that caused Confederate intelligence to miss the Gatling gun still exist. Immediate threats always crowd out potential future threats. Existing doctrine always resists new paradigms. And the sound of hammers building the next revolutionary weapon is always dismissed as routine noise, until suddenly it isn't.